Your brother needs the money more than you do. Those 8 words, spoken over glazed ham and candlelit elegance, didn't just shatter my Christmas. They exposed a lie that had been festering in my family for 15 years. I'm Emma Rodriguez, and this is the story of how one dinner conversation led me to freeze every single account in our family's multi-million-dollar empire, leaving my stepmother and golden boy stepbrothers scrambling to explain where my inheritance went. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany dining table as my stepmother Linda raised her wine glass with that practiced smile she'd perfected over the years. Jake sat beside her, my 28-year-old stepbrother, who somehow always managed to look like he'd stepped out of a business magazine even at family dinners. His designer sweater probably cost more than most people's rent, but then again, money had never been an object for Jake Rodriguez. Not since he'd been welcomed into our family with open arms and an open checkbook. Linda's announcement came right after my father finished carving the ham, the kitchen still warm with the scent of cinnamon and cloves from her elaborate Christmas feast. She'd outdone herself this year, as she always did when my father returned from his business trips. The table groaned under the weight of her culinary perfectionism. Honey-glazed carrots arranged like tiny orange soldiers, mashed potatoes whipped to gallery-worthy peaks, green bean casserole that probably took 3 hours to prepare. Everything looked like it belonged in a holiday magazine spread, which was exactly the point. Linda Rodriguez had built her reputation in our Portland neighborhood on these kinds of displays. My father, Michael, had just settled back into his chair at the head of the table, loosening his tie after the long flight from San Francisco where he'd been closing another commercial development deal. His eyes were bright with that particular satisfaction he got from successful business ventures, and I could tell he was already mentally calculating profit margins and expansion possibilities. He'd been running Rodriguez Property Development for 25 years, building it from a small residential construction company into one of the Pacific Northwest's most respected commercial development firms. Jake was regaling us with stories from his promotion at TechFlow Solutions, where he'd recently been elevated to senior software engineer with a salary that would make most people dizzy. He had this way of talking about his achievements that managed to sound humble, while ensuring everyone understood exactly how impressive he was. His latest project involved developing security software for banks, which apparently came with stock options and a corner office overlooking the Willamette River. That's when Linda made her announcement, her voice carrying that tone she used when she wanted to sound both generous and wise. She explained how she'd been thinking about our family's financial future, how important it was to make smart decisions about investments and inheritance planning. She talked about responsibility and practical thinking, using phrases like fiduciary duty and long-term stability that sounded impressive but felt rehearsed. Then came the bomb. She'd spoken with their financial advisor about my trust fund, the one my biological mother Elena had established before her death 17 years ago. According to Linda, the advisor had recommended consolidating family assets for better investment opportunities. Jake needed capital to start his own tech consulting firm, she explained, and it made more sense to redirect my trust fund toward his business venture since he had the experience and connections to make it profitable. Your brother needs the money more than you do, she said, reaching across the table to pat my hand with that condescending gesture she'd mastered over the years. You're doing well with your little graphic design business, and you've always been so independent. Jake has bigger plans that could benefit the whole family. The room went silent, except for the soft jazz playing from the hidden speakers Linda had installed throughout the house. My father's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and I could see the confusion starting to form in his eyes. Jake suddenly became very interested in his wine glass, avoiding eye contact with anyone at the table. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, spreading outward like spilled ice water. My trust fund wasn't just some casual inheritance. It was my mother's final gift to me, established when she was diagnosed with the rare blood disorder that would eventually lead to the car accident that killed her. She'd liquidated her own inheritance from my grandmother, added proceeds from her successful interior design business, and created a substantial trust that was supposed to mature when I turned 25. That birthday had passed 3 months ago, and I'd been expecting the transfer of funds that would finally give me the independence to expand my own design studio. But according to Linda, Those funds were better invested in Jake's future. After all, he was the one with the MBA from Oregon State, the one with the business connections, the one who understood finance and investments. I was just the artsy stepdaughter who drew pictures for small businesses and nonprofit organizations. My father set down his fork completely now, his business instincts clearly sensing that something wasn't adding up. He'd built his success on reading contracts and understanding financial structures, and I could see him mentally reviewing what he knew about Elena's trust fund. He'd been the executor initially, but had transferred those responsibilities to Linda after their marriage, trusting her to handle the administrative details while he focused on growing the business. The trust fund wasn't small. Elena had been incredibly successful with her interior design firm, working with high-end clients throughout the Pacific Northwest before her illness forced her to scale back. She'd also inherited a significant amount from my grandmother Rosa, who'd invested wisely in Portland real estate during the city's early growth periods. Combined with life insurance proceeds and investment growth over 17 years, the trust was worth just over $800,000. $800,000 that Linda now claimed would be better spent launching Jake's consulting firm. $800,000 that my mother had specifically designated for my future, with detailed instructions about how it should be managed and distributed. $800,000 that I'd been counting on to lease a proper studio space, hire additional designers, and build the creative agency I'd been dreaming about since college. Jake finally looked up from his wine glass, and I caught something in his expression that made my pulse quicken. Not surprise, not confusion, but resignation. Like someone who'd been dreading this conversation but knew it was inevitable. He knew about this plan he'd probably known for weeks, maybe months. Linda continued explaining her reasoning, her voice taking on that patient tone she used when she thought someone wasn't understanding something important. She talked about risk management and diversification, about how my design business was too small and unstable to justify such a large investment. She mentioned the challenges facing creative industries, the uncertainty of freelance income, the wisdom of supporting ventures with proven track records and growth potential. But underneath all the financial jargon, her message was clear. Jake deserved the money more than I did. Jake with his prestigious degree and corporate connections. Jake, who understood business and finance. Jake, who'd been raised to think of himself as the family's golden child, destined for success and supported by whatever resources were necessary to achieve it. My father was looking between Linda and me now, clearly sensing the tension but not yet understanding the full scope of what was happening. He'd been traveling constantly for the past 6 months, closing deals in California and Arizona, expanding Rodriguez property development into new markets. He trusted Linda to manage family finances while he focused on business growth, and this was probably the first he was hearing about any changes to my trust fund. I realized that Linda had waited for this moment deliberately. Christmas dinner, with my father jet-lagged and distracted, surrounded by the warm glow of family tradition and holiday generosity. She'd calculated that he'd be less likely to question her decision in this setting, more inclined to trust her judgment and avoid conflict during what should be a peaceful family celebration. But she'd miscalculated my reaction. Instead of accepting her explanation with quiet resignation, the way I'd learned to accept so many other disappointments over the years, I felt something different building inside me. Not hurt, not even anger, but a kind of crystalline clarity that cut through years of accumulated resentment and self-doubt. The money wasn't just an inheritance. It was my mother's voice reaching across 17 years to tell me that I mattered, that my dreams were worth investing in, that someone believed in my potential enough to sacrifice for it. Elena Rodriguez had worked 60-hour weeks building her design business, had carefully managed her investments, had planned every detail of that trust fund to ensure her daughter would have opportunities she'd never had. And Linda Rodriguez had decided that those opportunities belonged to someone else. I set down my own fork and looked directly at my stepmother, taking in her perfectly styled blonde hair and the expensive necklace my father had bought her for their anniversary. She was still talking, still explaining why this reallocation made financial sense, still using phrases like family unity and collective prosperity to justify stealing my inheritance. That's when I asked the question that would change everything. Where exactly is my trust fund right now, Linda? Which account is it in? The question hung in the air like smoke from blown-out candles. Linda's practiced smile flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself, but that brief hesitation told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't just recommended redirecting my trust fund. She'd already done it. Jake's face had gone pale above his designer sweater, and my father was sitting up straighter in his chair, his business instincts fully engaged now. The soft jazz continued playing, but the warm family atmosphere had evaporated completely, replaced by something sharp and dangerous. Linda recovered quickly, launching into an explanation about temporary transfers and investment opportunities, about how the money was safe and earning excellent returns in Jake's new business account. She made it sound routine, responsible, like any good financial manager would have made the same decision. But I'd grown up in a family business. I'd spent summers in my father's office, learning about contracts and fiduciary responsibility and the legal obligations that came with managing other people's money. I knew that trustees couldn't just redirect funds based on their personal opinions about what constituted a better investment. More importantly, I knew that my mother had been incredibly specific about the terms of that trust. She'd worked with expensive lawyers to ensure the money would be protected, that it would be available when I needed it, that no one could redirect it without my explicit consent. Consent I'd never given. Consent Linda had never asked for. My father was asking questions now, his voice taking on the sharp edge he used during difficult business negotiations. He wanted to see documentation, wanted to understand the timeline, wanted to know who had authorized what and when. But Linda kept deflecting, talking about family loyalty and big-picture thinking, treating his questions like unnecessary complications. That's when I realized the full scope of what had happened. This wasn't just about my trust fund. Linda had been managing our family's finances for years while my father traveled, handling everything from household expenses to investment accounts to business partnerships. She'd had access to everything, and the power to make decisions that my father assumed were routine administrative tasks. The trust fund was just the beginning. I thought about all the times Jake had received generous loans that never seemed to get repaid. The down payment for his luxury condo that had supposedly come from his own savings. The expensive car, the designer clothes, the investment in his friend's startup company that had crashed and burned within 6 months. Jake Rodriguez had been living off my family's money for years, funded by his mother's careful redirections and creative accounting. And now she'd decided that my inheritance should join the flow of resources always moving in his direction. But Linda had made one crucial mistake in her calculations. She'd assumed I would react the way I always had, with quiet acceptance and polite resignation. She'd expected me to trust her judgment, to prioritize family harmony over my own interests, to be grateful for whatever scraps remained after Jake's needs were satisfied. She didn't know that I'd spent the last 3 years quietly building relationships with every client Rodriguez property development. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story I had ever worked with. She didn't know that I'd designed marketing materials for half the businesses in Portland's Pearl District, that I had connections throughout the city's creative and professional communities, that I'd been carefully establishing my own network while pretending to be satisfied with small freelance projects. Most importantly, she didn't know that my mother had been much smarter than anyone realized when she established that trust fund. Elena Rodriguez hadn't just created a simple inheritance. She'd built a sophisticated financial structure with multiple safeguards and automatic triggers that activated if anyone tried to misuse the funds. And she'd made me the primary beneficiary with full veto power over any transfers once I turned 25. Linda was still talking, still trying to frame this as a family decision that everyone should support, when I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app I downloaded 3 months ago when the trust fund was supposed to transfer. With a few quick taps, I accessed the account monitoring system that had been sending me notifications about every transaction. The notifications I'd been ignoring because I'd trusted Linda's explanations about administrative delays and paperwork processing. The screen filled with transfer records dating back 6 months. Not just my trust fund, but business accounts, investment portfolios, even the emergency fund my father kept for unexpected expenses. Hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing into accounts controlled by Linda and Jake, disguised as loans and investments and temporary transfers. My family's entire financial empire had been quietly restructured to benefit 2 people who'd contributed nothing to building it. I looked up from my phone to find 3 pairs of eyes watching me with very different expressions. My father looked confused and increasingly angry as he processed what my silence might mean. Jake looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair, and Linda looked like someone who just realized that her careful planning might have overlooked something important. "Dad," I said quietly, holding up my phone so he could see the screen. "I think you need to look at this." The next few minutes would determine whether my family's Christmas dinner became a reunion or a reckoning. But I already knew which one I was choosing. Because $800,000 wasn't just money. It was my mother's belief in my future, stolen by people who'd already taken everything else they could get their hands on. And I was done letting them take anything more. The banking app's screen glowed between us like evidence at a crime scene, each transaction record a small betrayal documented in cold digital precision. My father leaned forward, his reading glasses catching the chandelier light as he squinted at the phone display. I watched his expression change as he processed what he was seeing, his businessman's mind quickly calculating the scope of what Linda had orchestrated. The first transfer had happened 6 months ago, just 2 weeks after my 25th birthday. $50,000 moved from the Elena Rodriguez Memorial Trust to something called Junior Consulting Ventures, which I now realized must be Jake's business account. The memo line read, "Initial startup investment family loan." But there had been no family meeting about this loan, no discussion of terms or repayment schedules. The money had simply vanished from my inheritance into Jake's pocket. Linda's face had shifted from confident explanation to something resembling panic, though she was trying to hide it behind her usual mask of reasonable concern. She reached for my phone, probably planning to dismiss what we were seeing as some kind of banking error or misunderstanding, but my father held up a hand to stop her. His voice carried the authority that had built Rodriguez Property Development into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Michael Rodriguez hadn't become successful by ignoring financial irregularities or accepting convenient explanations when the numbers didn't add up. He'd survived 3 economic downturns, countless difficult negotiations, and more than a few business partners who'd tried to take advantage of his trusting nature. But he'd learned from every experience, developing an instinct for deception that had served him well in both business and life. Or so he'd thought. Looking at him now, I could see the realization dawning that his instincts had failed him completely when it came to his own household. Jake had gone completely silent. His earlier enthusiasm about his promotion and career prospects evaporated into the kind of stillness that comes from knowing you've been caught in something indefensible. He wasn't even trying to maintain eye contact with anyone at the table, instead focusing on his wine glass as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Linda, however, wasn't giving up without a fight. She launched into damage control mode, her voice taking on that reasonable, slightly condescending tone she used when she needed to explain why her decisions were actually for everyone's benefit. She talked about investment opportunities and family financial planning, about how Jake's business ventures would eventually benefit everyone through increased family wealth and diversified income streams. But my father was scrolling through more transactions now, and each new discovery was making her explanations sound increasingly hollow. $75,000 transferred to JRL Property Holdings 3 months ago. $40,000 moved to Rodriguez Family Investment LLC just 6 weeks ago. Another $60,000 redirected to something called Chen Rodriguez Ventures that I'd never heard of before. Chen was Linda's maiden name, which meant she'd been creating business entities using both her name and our family name without my father's knowledge. The scope of her financial maneuvering was becoming clear, and it extended far beyond my trust fund into areas of our family finances that should have required my father's direct authorization. My father's jaw was tightening in the way it did when he was processing information that contradicted everything he'd believed to be true. He prided himself on being detail-oriented, on understanding every aspect of his business and personal finances. The idea that hundreds of thousands of dollars had been moving around without his knowledge was hitting him like a personal failure as much as a financial betrayal. Linda was still talking, but her explanations were becoming more frantic and less coherent. She mentioned consulting with financial advisors whose names she couldn't quite remember, referenced conversations about tax advantages that she couldn't quite explain, and talked about legal structures that she obviously didn't fully understand herself. The truth was becoming obvious to everyone at the table. Linda Rodriguez had been systematically looting our family's assets to fund her son's lifestyle and business ventures. using her position as financial manager to authorize transfers that would have required extensive documentation and approval if anyone else had been watching. But the most damaging revelation was still coming. My father had reached the bottom of the transaction list, where the earliest transfers were recorded. These weren't recent decisions made in response to Jake's career opportunities. They went back almost 3 years, to right around the time Jake had purchased his luxury condo in the Pearl District. The down payment for that condo, which Jake had proudly claimed came from his own savings and smart investing, had actually come from a Rodriguez property development business account. The loan had been documented as a temporary advance against future profits, but there was no record of any repayment or even discussion of repayment terms. Jake's expensive car, purchased 18 months ago, had been financed through another creative transfer from a family investment account. The vacation to Europe he'd taken last summer, the designer furniture in his condo, even the engagement ring he'd bought for his girlfriend Sarah, had all been funded through Linda's careful redirections of family money. My stepbrother had been living like a wealthy young professional for years, funded entirely by resources that belonged to other people. And Linda had orchestrated every transfer, creating a paper trail of false business entities and fictional loans to hide the reality that she was simply stealing from her husband's family business to support her son's ambitions. The silence at the table had become oppressive, broken only by the soft jazz music that now seemed absurdly cheerful given the gravity of what we were discovering. The elaborate Christmas dinner Linda had prepared was cooling untouched, the festive decorations casting shadows that felt more ominous than welcoming. My father finally set down my phone and looked directly at Linda, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of controlled fury that was more frightening than shouting. He asked her to explain in detail how she had authorized these transfers without his knowledge. He wanted to understand the legal structures she'd created, the documentation she'd filed, and the authority she'd claimed to make these decisions. Linda's response was a mixture of deflection and attack. She accused my father of being absent and uninvolved, of leaving her to handle complex financial decisions while he traveled constantly for business. She claimed that someone had to make hard choices about family investments, that someone had to plan for the future, while he was focused on closing deals and expanding the company. But her defensive anger only made her look more guilty. She was attacking my father for trusting her, for giving her the authority to manage family finances while he focused on earning the money she'd been redistributing. She was essentially admitting that she'd abused his trust while blaming him for extending it in the first place. Jake finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. He tried to frame himself as an innocent beneficiary who hadn't understood the source of the funds he'd been receiving. He talked about assuming the money was coming from legitimate family loans and business partnerships, about trusting his mother's explanations without questioning the details. But his protests rang hollow when considered alongside the sheer volume of money he'd accepted over the years. Jake Rodriguez had received hundreds of thousands of dollars from various family accounts, enough money to fund a lifestyle far beyond what his salary could support. And he'd never once questioned where it was coming from or whether it was legitimate. More damaging was the timeline of his business planning. Jake had been talking about starting his own consulting firm for over a year, discussing business plans and investment requirements with the kind of detail that suggested extensive planning and preparation. He'd known exactly how much money he would need and exactly when he would need it. The timing of the trust fund transfer wasn't coincidental. Jake had been waiting for my 25th birthday, when the Elena Rodriguez Memorial Trust would become available for redistribution. He'd planned his business launch around gaining access to my inheritance, treating my mother's final gift to me as his own personal startup capital. That realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just financial fraud or family favoritism gone wrong. This was calculated theft that had been planned for months, possibly years. Jake and Linda had been counting down the days until my trust fund matured, preparing to steal my inheritance before I even knew it was available. My father was asking more pointed questions now, his voice taking on the tone he used during business depositions when he suspected someone was lying to him. He wanted to see documentation for every business entity Linda had created. He wanted explanations for every transfer she'd authorized. He wanted to understand how she'd gained signature authority on accounts that should have required his direct approval. Linda's answers were becoming increasingly evasive. She talked about power of attorney documents she couldn't locate, about verbal agreements she couldn't substantiate, about legal advice she'd received from lawyers whose names she suddenly couldn't remember. Her earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the desperate scrambling of someone whose lies were collapsing faster than she could construct new ones. But the most devastating moment came when my father asked about the Elena Rodriguez Memorial Trust specifically. He wanted to understand how Linda had gained access to an account that had been established with very specific legal protections, designed to prevent exactly this kind of unauthorized transfer. Linda's explanation revealed the true depth of her deception. She'd been forging my signature on authorization documents for months, using her position as my stepmother to claim authority over decisions that legally belonged only to me. She'd created false documentation suggesting that I'd requested the transfers, that I'd agreed to redirect my inheritance toward Jake's business ventures. The forgery wasn't sophisticated. Linda had simply been signing my name to documents and filing them with financial institutions that had no reason to question the authenticity of paperwork coming from the family's primary financial manager. But forgery was a federal crime, and the amounts involved elevated it to the level of felony fraud. My father sat back in his chair, the full scope of Linda's betrayal finally clear. She hadn't just made poor financial decisions or exercised questionable judgment. She'd committed systematic fraud against her own family, stealing from both her husband's business and her stepdaughter's inheritance, while documenting her crimes in elaborate detail. Jake's situation was almost worse. He'd been a willing beneficiary of fraud for years, accepting money he knew wasn't legitimately his while maintaining the pretense of being a successful young professional. His entire lifestyle was built on stolen funds, his business plans depended on continuing access to other people's money, and his engagement to Sarah was being financed through criminal activity. The Christmas dinner that was supposed to celebrate our family's success and togetherness had instead revealed that our family was built on lies, theft, and betrayal. The warm lighting and festive decorations now seemed like stage props for a performance that had finally ended with the curtain being pulled back to reveal the ugly reality behind the facade. But I wasn't devastated by these revelations. Instead, I felt a kind of clarity that I hadn't experienced in years. All the small slights and forgotten birthdays, all the times I'd been made to feel like my needs were less important than Jake's ambitions, all the occasions when I'd been told to be more grateful for whatever scraps remained after the golden child had been satisfied, suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't just favoritism or family dysfunction. This was organized theft disguised as family management, and I'd been the primary victim from the very beginning. Linda and Jake had built their version of our family's future on the foundation of my stolen inheritance, and they'd been planning to continue that theft indefinitely. But they'd made one crucial mistake in their calculations. They'd assumed I would never find out, never question the delays in accessing my trust fund, never investigate the financial structures they'd created to hide their crimes. They'd counted on my continued passivity and acceptance, on my willingness to prioritize family harmony over my own interests. But I'd stopped being that person the moment I saw my mother's money flowing into Jake's business account. The woman who died in a car accident 17 years ago had worked too hard and sacrificed too much for her final gift to be stolen by people who'd contributed nothing to earning it. Elena Rodriguez had believed in my potential enough to secure my future, and I wasn't going to let anyone diminish that gift through their own greed and deception. My father was looking at me now, waiting to see how I would respond to these revelations. Linda was still trying to salvage the situation with increasingly desperate explanations. Jake was staring at his plate like he hoped the table would swallow him whole. But I was already planning my next move, thinking through the steps I would need to take to not just recover my stolen inheritance, but to ensure that Linda and Jake faced consequences for what they'd done to our family. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about justice, accountability, and making sure that my mother's memory wasn't dishonored by the people who'd turned her final act of love into an opportunity for theft. The real confrontation was just beginning. The weight of my phone felt different in my hands now, transformed from a simple communication device into something far more powerful. I opened the banking app again, but this time I wasn't just reviewing transaction history. I was accessing the administrative controls that came with being the primary beneficiary of the Elena Rodriguez Memorial Trust. Controls that Linda had apparently forgotten existed when she'd been forging documents and redirecting funds. My mother had been incredibly thorough when she'd established the trust. Working with some of Portland's most expensive estate planning attorneys, she'd built in safeguards that would protect the money from exactly the kind of manipulation we'd just discovered. The trust wasn't just a simple inheritance account. It was a sophisticated financial structure with multiple layers of protection, automatic alerts, and emergency protocols designed to prevent unauthorized access. More importantly, the trust gave me immediate authority to freeze any accounts that had received funds from Elena Rodriguez Memorial Trust without proper authorization. This included not just the obvious transfers to Jake's business accounts, but any secondary accounts that had been funded using my stolen inheritance as collateral or seed money. I started with Jake's primary business account, the one listed as Junior Consulting Ventures. With a few taps on my phone, I initiated an emergency freeze that would prevent any further transactions until the account could be audited for fraudulent activity. The system required verification of my identity and authority, which I provided using the biometric security features my mother's lawyers had insisted on implementing. Jake's phone buzzed almost immediately with what I assumed was a notification from his bank about unusual account activity. His face went even paler as he read whatever message had appeared on his screen, and he looked up at me with something approaching panic. Linda was still trying to control the narrative, explaining to my father that these were all legitimate business transactions that had been properly documented and approved through appropriate channels. But her voice had taken on a shrill quality that made her sound increasingly desperate and unhinged. I moved to the next account, something called Chen Rodriguez Ventures, that had received $75,000 from my trust fund 3 months ago. The freeze process was just as simple, requiring only my biometric verification and a brief explanation of suspected fraudulent activity. Within seconds, another account containing my stolen inheritance was locked down pending investigation. My father was watching me work, his expression unreadable, but his attention completely focused on what I was doing. He understood enough about financial systems to recognize that I wasn't just making empty threats or throwing a tantrum. I was systematically shutting down access to accounts that contained funds that legally belonged to me. Jake finally found his voice, asking what I thought I was doing, and demanding that I stop interfering with his business operations. His indignation might have been more convincing if his business operations hadn't been entirely funded by money stolen from my inheritance. He talked about contracts and commitments, about clients and deadlines, about professional obligations that would be jeopardized if his accounts remained frozen. But his protests only confirmed what I'd suspected. Jake's entire consulting business was built on access to my trust fund money. He'd been using my inheritance as working capital, funding his operations and lifestyle with resources that were never legitimately his to begin with. Freezing his accounts wasn't just recovering stolen money, it was exposing the reality that his professional success was entirely artificial. Linda tried a different approach, appealing to family loyalty and urging me to consider the bigger picture. She talked about how freezing these accounts would damage Jake's reputation and career prospects, how it would create legal complications that could hurt the entire family's financial standing. She painted a picture of devastating consequences flowing from what she characterized as my vindictive overreaction to a simple misunderstanding. But I'd moved beyond caring about Linda's version of family loyalty. The woman who'd been systematically stealing from me for years was now concerned about protecting the reputation of her son, who'd been the primary beneficiary of her theft. She wanted me to prioritize their interests over my own rights, just as I'd been doing unconsciously for most of my adult life. The third account freeze was even more satisfying. Rodriguez Family Investment LLC had received $60,000 from my trust fund just 6 weeks ago, money that should have been sitting in my account earning interest while I planned the expansion of my design business. Instead, it had been redirected to fund whatever scheme Linda and Jake had cooked up under the guise of family investment planning. My father was asking pointed questions now about these business entities that had been created using the Rodriguez family name without his knowledge or consent. As the primary owner of Rodriguez Property Development, he had legal rights regarding the use of the family name in business ventures. Linda's creation of these companies represented another layer of deception that extended beyond simple financial fraud into areas of trademark and business identity theft. Jake's phone was buzzing constantly now, as more notifications arrived about frozen accounts and suspended transactions. Whatever business operations he'd been running were grinding to a halt, as his access to working capital disappeared. His earlier confidence about his career prospects and business acumen was evaporating as the artificial foundation of his success crumbled. I accessed the fourth account, something called JRL Property Holdings, that I'd never heard of before today. This one had received funds not just from my trust, but from several Rodriguez property development business accounts that should have required my father's direct authorization. The scope of Linda's theft was expanding beyond my inheritance into areas that directly impacted my father's business operations. Freezing this account required additional verification because it involved business funds rather than just trust money. But the banking system recognized my authority as the beneficiary of funds that had been illegally transferred, giving me emergency powers to protect assets that belonged to me regardless of where they'd been moved. My father's expression was darkening, as he realized that Linda's financial manipulation extended into his business accounts. Rodriguez property development's success depended on careful cash flow management and strategic investment planning. If Linda had been redirecting business funds without authorization, she'd been jeopardizing not just family assets but the livelihood of everyone who worked for the company. Linda's explanations were becoming increasingly frantic and contradictory. She claimed to have documentation for every transaction, but couldn't produce any of the paperwork when my father demanded to see it. She referenced conversations and agreements that apparently no one else remembered having. She insisted that everything had been done legally and transparently, while simultaneously admitting that she'd been making decisions without proper consultation or approval. Jake was trying to salvage something from the wreckage, offering to repay the money immediately if I would just unfreeze his accounts and allow his business operations to continue. But his offer was meaningless, because he didn't have any money to repay. Everything he owned, from his luxury condo to his expensive car to his business equipment, had been purchased using funds stolen from family accounts. More importantly, his assumption that this was negotiable revealed how fundamentally he misunderstood the situation. This wasn't a family dispute that could be resolved through compromise and apologies. This was criminal fraud that had been documented in extensive detail, and the evidence was sitting in frozen accounts that would soon be subject to forensic auditing. I moved to the final account, Jake's personal checking account that had been receiving regular transfers disguised as salary payments from the fictional consulting business Linda had created. Even his day-to-day living expenses had been subsidized by stolen money, meaning that his entire lifestyle was built on criminal activity. Freezing this account would leave Jake without access to funds for basic expenses, but that wasn't my concern anymore. He'd been living off my inheritance for years, while I worked part-time jobs and lived in a cramped apartment, saving every dollar I could while assuming my trust fund was safely growing toward my eventual access. His temporary inconvenience was nothing compared to the years of financial struggle I'd endured, while he enjoyed a lifestyle funded by my stolen money. My father was standing up from the table now, his dinner completely forgotten, as he processed the full scope of what Linda had done to our family. He wasn't just angry about the theft itself, but about the elaborate deception she'd maintained, while he'd been working to build the business that had funded her son's fraudulent lifestyle. Rodriguez property development represented decades of careful planning, strategic risk-taking, and personal sacrifice. My father had missed family dinners and birthday parties, had worked weekends and holidays, had invested every available resource into building something that would provide security and opportunity for his family. And Linda had been treating the results of his efforts as her personal bank account, redirecting funds to support her son's ambitions while creating an elaborate fiction to hide her crimes. Linda made one final attempt to frame the situation as a misunderstanding that could be resolved through family discussion and compromise. She talked about the importance of unity and forgiveness, about how involving lawyers and law enforcement would only hurt everyone involved. She painted herself as someone who'd made mistakes while trying to help the family, rather than someone who'd committed systematic fraud over a period of years. But her plea for family unity rang hollow, coming from someone who'd been actively working against the interests of half the family for years. She'd prioritized Jake's success over everyone else's rights, had stolen from both her stepdaughter and her husband to fund her son's artificial lifestyle, and had maintained elaborate lies to hide her crimes from the people she was supposed to be protecting. I looked around the table at the remnants of what was supposed to be a Christmas celebration. The expensive decorations and elaborate meal now seemed like props in a performance that had finally ended with the revelation of truth. Linda's carefully crafted image as the perfect wife and stepmother had been exposed as a facade hiding criminal behavior. Jake's identity as a successful young professional had been revealed as entirely artificial, built on access to stolen money rather than legitimate business acumen. His plans for the future, his engagement to Sarah, his reputation in Portland's tech community were all based on resources he'd never legitimately earned. But I wasn't devastated by these revelations. Instead, I felt a clarity and sense of purpose that I hadn't experienced in years. The woman who'd died when I was 8 years old had worked to secure my future, and I wasn't going to let anyone diminish her gift through their own greed and deception. My phone showed confirmation that all 5 accounts containing funds from my trust had been successfully frozen pending investigation. Jake's business operations had been shut down, Linda's investment schemes had been exposed, and my father was finally seeing the truth about the family dynamics he'd trusted Linda to manage while he focused on building our financial foundation. The stolen money was just the beginning. I was planning to ensure that Linda and Jake faced appropriate consequences for what they'd done, that my father understood the full scope of their deception, and that my mother's memory was honored rather than dishonored by the resolution of this situation. Because Elena Rodriguez had believed in my potential enough to secure my future, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that gift away from me again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.